All right. Good morning, saints.
Good morning.
Shalom, shalom. We got a lot of great stuff coming up in the coming weeks. Brother Metzger will be here next week. I encourage you to come listen to him. We were on the phone, I think it was two Tuesdays ago, just going back and forth, throwing the ball back and forth on what he wanted to talk about. And the subject that he's going to be talking about is very exciting. I got excited just chatting about it on the phone. And so if you can be here next week, please come and listen to that. It's something you've probably heard before, wink, wink, but he's going to go into a lot of detail well beyond what we've done from the pulpit so far. And as we discussed it, it's a very exciting subject if he's sticking to what he said. So I'm hyping up something based upon that. So when he gets here, if it changes, I'll tell you what he was going to do. How's that sound? A couple other things. So there was there slides before this on here? There should be. Well, while they're looking for that, it should be under the sermon number 2, dated the 26th, but there should be a couple slides before that. Anyhow, so we have the Valentine's Day dinner coming up, right? So everyone is aware of that. I heard we're having Italian food. So for those of you who have to have something of the great persuasion with your Italian, I was told that it is BYOB. Okay? And there is a twist-off capping fee if you do bring your own grape juice. Okay? So, but no, it actually is a really cool menu. It's a catered group that's doing it, and it sounds like there's a ziti plate and some chicken parmesan. I mean, it looks like a killer menu. And so, what's that? Gluten-free. So, gluten-free pasta is awesome. But don't mind me, I'll just be there for the food. So, before we continue, do we get that thing running? Oh, they're still looking. Okay. Well, let's open up in prayer, and then we'll go into God's Word. Father, Lord, guide us in this study. Today's a harder subject, especially with the choice of vocabulary that Jesus, your brother, used in writing his letter, that your earthly brother used. And what an amazing thing to say out loud. But Lord, guide us in the study of your text. Let us see that when the Spirit inspired Jude to write this, that Jude was very selective in his vocabulary and the terms that he used in such a short letter, yet such a rich letter. And as we go through this in the coming weeks, illuminate us to who you are so that we can worship a God that we know. I ask this in your Son's name. Amen. Okay. Did I break the internet? What's that? Okay, we'll go. You can bring it up. It's fine. It should be dated like today's date, 1/26. Yeah, that's it. Okay, you're good. Okay, so I'll give a brief announcement. So somebody at the Live Nativity left a wonderful pair of LL Bean boots in front of my office. They don't fit me. And I had a picture of Cinderella's sisters trying on the slipper that I was going to show you, of, the one with her foot all bent inside the slipper. Well, that's how they fit me. So they're definitely a ladies' LL Bean Maine Hunter boot. Very much, the Gucci boots from LL Bean that I always wished I could have, because you get that lifetime warranty. You can send them back. They put new soles on them. But there's a pair of those. So there is a first century Israelite running around without shoes from the Nativity. So if you're missing a lady set of LL Bean Maine Hunter boots, come by my office. They are stashed in there. You just have to imagine the Cinderella pictures. So 2 weeks ago, we didn't meet last week due to the weather, but 2 weeks ago we started diving into the backgrounds of the letter of Jude. It's a very short letter in the New Testament. And we went through several subjects. We're going to do a quick recap on this. But we went into observations around the letter, when it was probably written, the composition, the things that Jude is talking about. And so we're going to do a quick recap on that, because today we're actually going to go into just the first couple verses, because Jude, right out of the gate, gives us a very loaded selection of terms around who Jesus is. And we're going to go into those today, especially around one particular term that is kind of tucked away in the text, and the meaning behind it, without what we're going to discuss today, you can almost read over it. And so with the author's identification in the immediate text, we recapped and went through that his name was Yehuda, so we know that this was a Jewish guy when we're trying to identify the human author. He self-identifies as a servant of Jesus, but then he also says that he's the brother of a man named Jacob or James, and Yaakov in Hebrew. And so we started to narrow down that this probably is Jesus' earthly brother through Mary. So Jesus' humanity comes through his mother Mary, and we had to dispel some myths. And so some of those myths that we had to dispel come from the concepts of the Holy Family. If you grew up in a Roman Catholic background or East Orthodox background, they both have their own expression of what the Holy Family was. And as we progress, we're also going to see that there is a misconception in the letter of Jude that he pulled from extra-biblical Jewish sources that predate him. That's actually not true. It's actually probably the opposite, is that the extra-biblical sources probably pulled from a Jewish tradition that Jude pulled from that is correct. And it just happens to be that the letter of Jude came later, but it probably has the earlier tradition in it. And we will get into that in coming weeks. But as you go through, what we were looking for is that these Labradors in the Nativity, right? So we saw Lexington the Labrador, the Where's Waldo dog that kind of floated around the live Nativity at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. And up until this year, I had no idea what the dog's name was. So we would always say, when someone says something theologically weird, we go, that's the Labrador in the Nativity, where it just didn't fit in the corpus of Scripture. And so we saw some of those last week. But as we went through and discovered these things about the person of Jude, we realized that he is the Jude in the Gospels. And in your Gospel English translations, typically he's called Judah. And then when you get over to his letter in the English tradition, we alter that to Jude. There's a couple reasons for that. One of the reasons that the English tradition does that is we don't want to mistake him for Judas Iscariot, because in the Greek text, they're both Yehudas, or Eudas, right? And so we don't want to mistake this Judah for this Judah. And so as we do our deductive reasoning and start reducing who this author was, we realize it's the brother of Jesus. And we see that he had several brothers. He had James, who became the first elder of the church of Jerusalem. He had a brother named Joseph, so young Joseph was named after his dad, Mary's husband. And then we have Shimon, or Simon. And then he had several sisters. We actually don't know how many sisters he had, but it's sisters plural. So on top of Jesus, you have at least 6 other kids in the family. So that's a very Jewish household. Lots of kids, right? And so we see that in the Gospels, both in Mark 6 as well as in Matthew 13. They both Gospel writers name his brothers and then say that he had sisters, plural. And so this Judah is probably the one who wrote the letter. We also looked at the actual family of Jesus. And so as we go through church history, especially the writer Eusebius, he names bishops or chief elders of Jerusalem. And at this time, the church is really small. And so the word bishop really didn't have the connotation that it does in a Episcopal church government as it does today. This is the chief elder in a congregation that probably numbered about this size. I mean, the church in Jerusalem was not big. And that chief elder, typically for the first 135 years of the church, one was Jewish, but two, they were all nephews of Jesus. And so they were either his nephews or in some cases, maybe his cousins. And so this entire line going down, and I did a 1-2 skip a few, but as you go through the first 4 generations down to the 15th generation, the last Jewish elder of Jerusalem, that was Jude who wrote this letter. That was his great-grandson. And so that was Jesus' nephew. And so for the longest time, until the Bar Kokhba rebellion, when there was a giant Jewish rebellion against the Romans, 65 years after the destruction of the temple, the Nazarenes, and we're going to see what that word means today, the Nazarenes, the Jewish believers, actually participated in that rebellion early on. And then as the rabbis in 135, especially Rabbi Akiva, you can Google Rabbi Akiva, very famous rabbi, he hailed Bar Kokhba, the leader of the rebellion, as the Messiah. And at that time, the Nazarenes kind of said, no deal, we're done. We were going to help you get our country back, but we're not hailing this guy as a Messiah. He's a false Messiah. And we see a departure of the Nazarenes from the rebellion because they don't want to get behind Bar Kokhba as being the promised Messiah in the Hebrew Bible. And so that's where when the Romans take over and completely change the name of Israel, they change it to Syria, Palestina, which is where the word Palestine actually comes from. It's a Roman name for a territory. Long story short, the nation of Palestine appropriated that in 1964 from this old Roman name. And Jerusalem, the name of Jerusalem changed to Aelia Capitolina. The Romans did not want any remnant of Jewish history to be left in the land. 585,000 Jews were killed in a matter of weeks in the rebellion in 135. And Jesus' family fled with the Jewish populace. And so we really don't know what happened to them. There's lots of Da Vinci Code conspiracy theories around that, which you've probably seen in Hollywood, but we truly don't know. And if the church historians didn't know in the 2nd century, Dan Brown, 20 years ago, has no idea, okay? And so, but they disappeared into history with the Jewish populace. We have some theories on where Jewish believers settled that Jesus' family may have gone to be in those communities, but beyond that, they're lost to Jewish history. So this dating of this letter. So the dating of Jude, the letter that we're going through, is probably before 62 AD. So we know that it's James and Jesus' little brother. And it's probably before the death of James. And James, the brother of Jesus, was killed, according to tradition, by Ananus and the Pharisees. And he was actually killed in a very illegal way. He was tried on the temple complex, and he was murdered on the temple complex. And instead of taking him outside the city and stoning him after finding him guilty, the legend is they took him up to the corner of the temple, pushed him off the corner. He fell 40 feet to the rock slab that is the Temple Mount even today. He fell onto that, survived it, and then was stoned to death on the temple complex, which is completely illegal in the Mosaic Law. And so he was actively murdered, if that is the case. But Jude seems to identify that with James as though he's still alive in his letter, because he's saying, hey, I'm the brother of James. And so there's not much indication that James has been killed. There's nothing in Jude's letter that indicates any great violence against James as of yet. But he's warning his congregation, and for all we know, this is the church in Jerusalem, the Jewish church in Israel. He's warning the people of men creeping in unnoticed into the congregations. But he's doing it against the backdrop of the Exodus and not Israelite history. So he's going back into the flood, and he goes back into the flood, not the Jewish war of 66 to 70 AD. So there's no indication that the temple's been destroyed. This is really important on dating Jude. And we looked at some of that 2 weeks ago because secular scholars say this wasn't a New Testament document. It's from the 2nd century or from the 3rd century, and it was written by this other person in Egypt. And just going off of this, in the 2nd century, after 135, if someone's writing and saying, hey, I'm a Jewish guy named Judah, and I'm going to write a letter to all these Christians, that's a death warrant. Why? Because he's identifying as being Jewish at a time when anti-Semitism is at an all-time high in Rome. So the fact that this letter circulated all the way to Turkey and all the way across North Africa means that it has to be written before 135, and it's probably by the brother of James and Jesus. Okay? So when we look at this, and this was the chart we ended on. It was on the handout 2 weeks ago. But we have these three kinds of Greek, and this is going to be really important with what we're looking at today, is we have these three kinds of Greek. We have this Greek on the left that they call it Semitic, and it's just that it has a Semitic influencing. So there's a lot of Hebrew words thrown into the Greek. There's a lot of idioms that make sense in Hebrew and Aramaic in the Greek. So you see this in John especially. You can see that most of those letters on the left are all John's works. So as the Apostle John writes his gospel, as he writes Revelation, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, there's a lot of Hebrew, Aramaic references in there. Mark tends to do this too, which his first name was also John. So he's Yochanan Mark, right? And so he also seems to be Israeli, and he's writing this, as well as Peter. And so what's really interesting is with Peter, in 2 Peter, he's writing with a lot of Hebrew word references, and this is going to be relevant to what we talked about today. Then over here on the right, Peter can be very eloquent in his Greek as well. So he can write with very eloquent Greek. And then you got Paul and Matthew kind of sitting in the middle. So Paul kind of writes the way he talks. And they're obviously very fluent men who knew Greek. These were trilingual, first century Jews. But when you get over to the right-hand column, who do we see in the right-hand column that are brothers? We see Jude and James. That means that their household had a very eloquent Greek upbringing, which means that Jesus had a very literary upbringing. He didn't just know conversational Greek. You can rest assured, and if you know a Jewish family and they invest in that oldest son, that if the younger two brothers are that literate, guess what? They've double timed it on the older boy, right? He sets the standard for the young siblings growing up. And if Jesus is the oldest brother, the way the Gospels say, then you can rest assured that he was very eloquent in Greek and very eloquent in Aramaic and Hebrew. And so this was a time, think about that, when people were dirt poor. And literacy is at an all-time high in their household. That tells you that we're from a tradition, a religious tradition of literacy. That did not change with the advent of the church. We are still a tradition of literacy. You have to be biblically literate. And Mary and Joseph apparently took that very seriously in how they raised their kids. So the composition. So this is the breakdown of some of the things he talks about in this letter. So he's well-versed, and we can see this, both from his grammar as well as what we're going to go through. He's well-versed in Jewish literature and stories. So both the Hebrew scriptures, and we're going to see that. He's going to go back into the Old Testament, and he's going to talk about extra-biblical Jewish stories, but that's not the same as pseudepigraphal. That means fake document or fake writing, Jewish works. And so we're going to see the difference between that. And that sounds like, you're probably thinking, John, this sounds like a seminary class. YouTube, go home and do this for me. YouTube Book of Jude and see how much weird stuff pops up. That's why. Is that as you go into this, there's a new movement, and it's coming from one side of nominal Christianity right now of don't read the Bible, read all this other stuff, and you don't need to read the Bible. That's the new approach. Like, believe the conspiracy theories. Why? Conspiracy theories aren't dull. That's the idea, right? And so there's a whole movement, and it's focused around this letter because they think this letter is short, therefore ambiguous, and there's a lot of false doctrine that comes in around this letter. So he says he has seen leaders of his people and false followers of Torah, so false followers of Moses and the Bible, commit terrible acts of violence against his own family. So even the ones who claim to keep the Mosaic law, he's saying they break it and commit terrible acts of violence. And as we went through spiritual warfare, chaotic violence is the complete opposite of what God wants. And we're going to see a pattern, and he does this on purpose. We're going to see a pattern of biblical examples of departure. He uses this word over and over again, of departing from God and what it deteriorates into. And really the terrible acts of violence is really what it deteriorates into. This is a common theme in the Bible. Okay, so if you have your Bibles open to Jude 1, or turn your handout over. Like I said, we're going to be a little bit cerebral today, but there's a reason for this. Okay, it is here. Okay. So Jude, I'm going to read this out loud. Jude, a servant of Jesus Christ and a brother of Jacob, to those summoned, having been loved in God the Father and having been kept, And that can mean guarded, watched over, or protected. We're going to go through that in Jesus Christ. So that's how he greets himself to these people. He says, may mercy, peace, and love be multiplied to you. And I always tell people, if you want to remember this, be multiplied. Has anyone ever seen this film? Can anyone identify this film from the picture? Three Amigos, all right. What is El Guapo asking Jefe right here before his birthday? Does he have what of piñatas? A plethora of piñatas, right? That is literally what Jude is saying in verb form to the people in Jerusalem. May you have a plethora of these things to you. Okay, so easy way to remember. Just remember El Guapo asking Jefe if he has a plethora of piñatas. And Jude saying, may mercy, peace, and love be a plethora to you. But let's back up for a minute. Let's go to verse 1. Because he says two very loaded terms here that, like I said, you could almost read over them. So the first one, let me back out here and get rid of El Guapo. There we go. The first one is to those summoned. Now, to some of your English Bibles may say to those called. Is this, now follow me with this, church. In what context have we normally heard in American Christianity having a calling? It's usually what? The pulpit, like it's the ministry, right? And so I remember my grandmother saying this. She grew up in a more charismatic leaning, and she used to always say, oh, he wasn't ready to be a preacher until he got the calling. And as a kid, I was like, what's that? What's the calling? And it was always with the definite article, the calling. And she came from a background that there was some kind of, and this is not true, this is not in the Bible, but this special calling to be a minister is somehow greater than what the lay elders do. 100% not true in the Bible. The men you just had up here as elders have just as much responsibility to this church as I do. I just get to hang out here more often. Right? I'm here. When you walk in the door, it's, you're going to see me, Mike, and Bonnie. Right? Hopefully, if it's not snowing. But you're going to see us three. But the responsibility of it, there's not a calling. There's a purpose from God, and he makes that known as you're walking through your Christian life, where there are times when you might be an elder, and there's times when you won't be. There's been times when I've been a lay elder, and I've interim preached, and there's times when I'm doing it as a vocation. None of those is one special calling over another where all of a sudden I felt this spiritual magnet telling me to do this. What Jude's saying here is, who is summoned by God? Does he differentiate and say this is just to the elders? It's the church of Jerusalem. Every believer has been summoned by God. Do you see that? That's the standard of calling in the Bible. Everybody, everyone in this room that confesses Jesus Christ has been called by God. You have been summoned for a purpose. Figure out what that is. So we had Brother Jack up here talking about serving. Let me tell you something. Any ministry you're in this church, you're going to be more committed than the people listening if you're teaching. You're going to be there when they're not there. You want to teach a class? If we had first hour without Jeff Wynell, guess what happens? No class. We play a video of that Scottish guy. He has a great accent, right? Or Welshman. They're neighbors. So I was told once if you had that kind of accent, you could utter complete heresy and it still sounds cool, right? And it's kind of true. And so, but without the teacher there, without the server, you're always going to be more committed than your students who's listening. It's an empirical reality. Don't wait for a calling. I'm like going off on a rabbit trail here, but don't wait for some kind of spiritual magnet to come out and hit you. If there's some kind of feeling you're feeling convicted, guess what? God's already inside talking to you. And the people that have been summoned have that spirit. And so he's saying you've already been summoned. This is a passive tense, okay? And he says, having been loved, so those who have been summoned have been loved in God and the Father. And then he says this, having been kept. in Jesus Christ. And this seems to be the unique role that he's saying Jesus has. That you're loved in God the Father, which obviously you're loved by Jesus as well. But in this context, he's using this having been kept, and it can mean guarded, watched, protected, watched over in Jesus Christ. And we're going to look at that today because there is something hidden here that as I went through this study myself, I didn't see it until the tail end of it. And so, bye-bye El Guapo. Okay, so having been kept or watched over, protected, these are, when you look up a lexicon, it says this, and everyone's like, John, I can't read that, that's Greek. It's all Greek to me. Yes, I know. So this word, tereo, and for those of you studying Revelation, it's not therio, it's not the beast. It sounds similar, but it's not. Someone asked me that, is tereo therio? No, it's not. This is a whole different word. But this word typically can mean the three things above. So that's the root for this big long Greek word on the upper left, is tereo. And it can mean having been kept, watched over, protected, guarded. So this can mean security. And we're going to look at this because there's a stereotype, and some of you may have heard this. If you're doing Living by the Book, I don't know if Dr. Hendricks actually says this or not, but I've heard even Dallas professors say that typically the Hebrew language is vague, and the Greek language is specific. So you can take a Hebrew word, and you can have 3 Greek words that could be the Hebrew word, right? Today we're going to see that that's not always true. Today we're going to see a Greek word that the New Testament authors use that can mean several Hebrew words. So it's actually backwards, okay? And this is really important because there's one that Jude is using that illuminates us to the person of Jesus in just this one phrase, having been kept. And I'm not overanalyzing this. Just follow me with this today, okay? So we have tereo, and typically, and this is very interesting, in the New Testament, tereo can be used to render 3 Hebrew words from the Old Testament. So it's backwards. Instead of having one Hebrew word and all these Greek words that can render this one word, it's actually backwards. The New Testament authors, and this is true of Luke, Jude, Matthew, they all use this word repeatedly. You think they all have the same rabbi or something. And they have these 3 Hebrew words, and we're going to look at these today. So the first one on the left is pronounced shamar, so I've got them in English underneath the letters, okay? The middle one is natsar, and the one on the right is safan. And these are the roots, the 3-letter roots. So we're working with root words because I don't want to do conjugation and mess anybody up here. But this tereo word can be used to render these 3 words in the New Testament. So as they cite or refer to Old Testament passages, they can be referring to these words. And so we're going to look at these real quick, because we're going to get to the last one. The last one's the most important. So safan, those of you who have kept Passover, this is going to sound really familiar, right? Safan. We're actually about to do safun, right? But safan, to hide something, to tuck it away. This idea in safan is like if I were to take this bottle and shove it back here under the Mary Poppins pulpit, that you can hide a car inside this thing. And so if I hide this in here, that's safan. So to hide something away. So if I protect you by hiding you in a hole and saying, here, dive in this hole and no one will see you, that's safan, right? To tuck something away and hide it from discovery. And we see this in Psalm 83. So if you're following in your Bibles, you can turn to Psalm 83. And if you're doing the handouts, all the definitions will be up here for you. But Psalm 83, verses 1 through 4, okay? It says God, Psalm of Asaph, God. And this is literally exclamation point crying out. Elohim, God, do not remain quiet. Do not be silent, and O God, do not be still. Because behold, your enemies make an uproar, and those who hate you have exalted themselves. They make shrewd plans against your people and conspire together against and this is that safan, your treasured ones, the ones that you've tucked away. They have said, come, let us wipe them out as a nation, that the name of Israel be remembered no more. We have nations crying that out today. Having to trade 90 terrorists for 3 hostages. And 30 more hostages to go. So do the math. It's amazing. Israel, I was watching a special last night that actually Brother Nate sent over. And it was very good, by the way. Of Sinwar, the one who planned the October attacks last year. You know when he was in jail, Israel helped cure him of brain cancer? He was dying and terminally ill of brain cancer. Israel cured him. He was turned loose and he went right back to Hamas. Because they say this, come, let us wipe them out as a nation, that the name of Israel be remembered no more. And you can rest assured that is also Gentiles who confess that Israel should exist. That the memory of Israel be remembered no more. That is not just the Jews in the land, that's the Jews in this room, that's the Gentiles in this room that claim that Israel should exist. But he's saying that they're conspiring together against your treasured ones. In the Septuagint, it says the holy ones. So hagios. So in the Greek translation of this, they use hagios. What is very interesting is the New Testament does not. We're going to keep going. Let's look at Psalm 119. So if you're turning in your Bibles, let's keep looking at this. These are other instances of this usage because I want you to see this. Psalm 119, verses 11 and 12. In my heart, and this is I have treasured. So verse 11, Psalm 119, verse 11. In my heart, I have treasured your utterance, that I may not sin against you. In the Greek Septuagint, it says, I hid. It's not tereo. That I may not sin against you. Blessed are you, Adonai, educate me of your statutes. When we get to the New Testament, and this is really important, is that in my heart, so you can't, those of you who took Greek can see this, but in her heart, in te cardia autes, is the exact same phrase up in Psalm 11 in the Greek Old Testament, okay, the Greek translation. However, when you get down to Mary treasuring things in her heart, so it says Mary sees these wonderful things that her son's doing, the Messiah, and says she treasured all these things, pondering them in te cardias. Is that in her heart, in te cardias autes. It's the exact same. Instead of saying in te cardias mu, my, it's in hers. What do they use for the word for to treasure up? Is this word tereo. So they're trying to do something special here with this tereo. And they use it twice. Luke uses it twice. It says that when they see him doing other things at Passover, when they have to go fetch him, that she treasured all of these things in her heart. And it's obvious that Luke is going back to Psalms. That Mary, in seeing God incarnate do these things as a boy, is just like the writer of Psalm 119 saying, let me treasure the utterances of your scripture in my heart. That's the level that Mary is taking, the degree she's taking with what she's seeing Jesus do. Does Mary believe that her son is God? I would think so. Not just by the angels telling her, she treats what he does and what he says just like the writer of Psalm 119. But they changed the word. It's this tereo again. This is the most obvious one, and we're about to do this today, is Safun. This is the stage in the Passover Seder. And we talked about this a few months back, but the stage in the Passover Seder is a noun form of this that means hidden or treasured away. It's when we take the matzah and wrap it in the white bag and put it away. When you pull it out, it's called Safun, that which is hidden. And it's supposed to be a sign, according to the Gospels and according to Paul, of Jesus being buried away and appearing again. And his body is wrapped up in white linen. That's the sign. And it's been called Zafun. And you know what? If you ask rabbis today, they argue over where this comes from. And I've said this ad nauseum from the pulpit, I know, but they literally do not want to admit where this came from. That it came from a custom of a group of Jews that we just showed their bishops up through 135 AD. That it got to be so popular in Jerusalem, and now there's PhDs willing to admit this in Israel at Hebrew University, that they say maybe the Nazarenes came up with this. Which you're sitting kind of back listening to it going, you think? Like, yeah, we've been doing it too ever since. Like, we haven't stopped, just like you haven't stopped. And the one piece that all the Christians keep from Passover is this, of course. But zafun, to hide it away, to make it appear again, that's literally the stage that we're about to do. And what's amazing about this, and I always have to repeat this, if you think that this came from the Nazarenes, who instituted this? For the Jewish populace who doesn't know, and for the believers who do know, who instituted this? Yeshua himself. The first time this was carried out was probably on Thursday night, April 33 AD. And it made its way into Passover across the board. Why? God's providence to make sure everyone understands the gospel even in the holiday. Doesn't matter if you're here or if you come to my house for Pesach or if you go to an Orthodox house for Pesach, guess what? They still all do safun. So that is safun. That's one option. You're like, that's not the sermon? No. That's one option. The next one is shamar, and this is the normal one. I would say this is the normal one. Shamar is really common, even in Hebrew today. If you say that you keep Shabbat, you say, Ani shomer Shabbat. I'm a keeper of Sabbath, which means I rest on Friday evening to Saturday at sunset. And so shamar literally means to keep or guard. But when it's used in relation to mitzvahs or commandments, if you think of the word bar mitzvah, like mitzvah commandment, when you shamar a commandment, that's how you say in Hebrew to obey it, is I will protect the commandment by not breaking the commandment. And so throughout the whole Old Testament, anytime there's mitzvahs given, there's usually this word shamar popping up saying, I'm going to guard the commandment, and that literally means to obey. It's the same as worship and obey in Eden, where it is first mentioned. So this is just before the Shema, and we're going to sing the Shema next week when Brother Metzger gets here. Just before the Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, or the Lord alone. In 6 verse 1, Deuteronomy 6 verse 1, these are the commandments, that's the commands or mitzvahs, decrees and laws, Adonai your God directed me to teach you, this is Moses speaking, to do in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess, so that you, your children, and their children after them may fear Adonai your God as long as you live, to shamar, literally to obey, all his decrees and commands that I give you, so that you may enjoy a long life. Now, what is normally translated there for the Septuagint, I know I keep going back to this, but it's literally the word guard, okay? Like to stand post. So whoever translated this part of the Septuagint got really, really literal with that. When we get over to the New Testament, Jesus says something different. And this is a dead giveaway that both Jesus and the New Testament authors did not always hold to the Septuagint. It says right here, and this is Jesus speaking to someone asking him about what is good. And he says, why are you asking me about what is good? There is only one who is good, but if you wish to enter into life, what does he say? Keep the commandments. Which commandments? These back here. So forward moving, here they're using that tereo again. It's a different word. The New Testament authors love this word. And why? I don't know, but we're getting there. But they love to use this over and over in different contexts. In this context, it seems to be shamar, because remember, Jesus is having this conversation in either Hebrew or Aramaic. So it's going to be the same. And then in John 14, verse 15, he says, if you love me, you will what? Keep my commandments. That's also tereo. It's this other Greek word that starts stemming out into these other Hebrew words. It's still tereo. Here's another example. So this is one of my favorite Psalms of all time. From West Virginia, got to have a psalm about the mountains, right? From the mountain state, got to do it. Song of Ascents. Anywhere you go in West Virginia, you're either ascending or descending, except the football field. And even that can be questionable. A Song of Ascents. So these were one of the psalms that the 15 steps we had out here for our live nativity. They would sing this as you were going into the Jewish court up those steps. I will lift my eyes to the mountains. From where shall my help come from? My help comes from Adonai, maker of heaven and earth. He will not allow your foot to give way. Your guardian, so this is a noun form, your guardian will not slumber. Behold, and it says, Shomer Yisrael, the protector of Israel, neither slumbers nor sleeps. Sometimes when you're in Israel, you will see IDF soldiers with a patch, a morale patch, like the PVC rubber patches that, you go to gun shows and they have them. And it will say, Shomer Yisrael, and have a big lion on it. Because the chief tribe of Israel is which tribe did the kingship come from? Judah. So the symbol's the lion, right? And they have Shomer Yisrael underneath it because they know. And I've had to ask Israeli soldiers about this. Some of them think that Shomer Yisrael is them, that the soldiers are the protectors of Israel. And then if you ask one who actually has his head on straight, he goes, do you honestly think this is about me? No. This is who they have to deal with if they get through me. Okay, now we're talking. Because if they get through the immediate soldier, who does the Gentile nations have to contend with? The Shomer Yisrael. And so they use it as a morale, but it's almost as a spiritual morale of saying, if they get through me, he is behind me. It's amazing. But they keep these as morale patches. You'll see it on their chest plates. You'll see these morale patches, Shomer Yisrael. And it's from this song. But this is another way that it's used in the Old Testament, where God actually guards the people of Israel. He actually protects them and makes sure that they will not be, he keeps them intact, is the best way to say this. The same way we keep the commandments intact by obeying them, he keeps Israel intact. And that's this other use of Shamar. But then we have this last one, and this is the one we're going to kind of sit on. It's Natsar. And Natsar is very interesting because it's kind of like Shamar and it's kind of like Zaphon, but it's got its own connotations. And as we go, we're going to see that Jude understands this. Jude has a really good grasp on who his brother was as the Messiah. So back to Psalm 119. So Psalm 119 uses all three of these root words. But here's an example of actually the two of them together. Teach me, Adonai, the way of your statutes, that I will consequently watch over them. And that's this Natsar. But then when you go down to the next one, give me understanding, I will observe, that's also Natsar, your Torah, and protect, and that is the one we just looked at. So they're using them synonymously. So you can see why the New Testament writers have no problem using one word for these two things. I will protect it in whole in my heart. How else is this used? I love this one. Psalm 31, verse 23. This is a commandment. Love Adonai. You almost want to respond like, yes, sir. But love Adonai, all his beloved faithful. Adonai watches over. So now it's a verb. This is something God's doing. Yahweh watches over and repays in full the arrogant person. Psalm 32, verse 7. You are a hiding place for me from distress. You watch over me with joyous cries of deliverance. You envelope me. That's literally what that means. Encircle me. Selah. 64:1. To the overseer musician, a psalm of David, and this is that same Shema as Hear O Israel. It says, Shema my voice, God. Listen to me in my meditations. And then, Natsar, my life, watch over my life from the dread of the enemy. David was a very insightful man. But then we come to this passage. And this is going to lead into what we're going to talk about in the New Testament with Natsar. Isaiah 49, verses 5 and 6. If you have your Bibles, I would open it to this passage because this is really important. This is one of the prophecies of what would be the church of God, and you're going to see it right here. They say in Ephesians that they didn't understand the equal blessing thing, but right here, salvation to the Gentiles is pretty blatant. And now, says Adonai, who formed me. Now, who's the me? Who's talking here? It's the Messiah, right? This is the Messiah in Isaiah's vision here. And now, says Adonai, who formed me from the womb to be his servant. And we see this in Isaiah 53, some of the things he's going to do as a suffering servant. But these are some of the things the servant, the Messiah servant, is supposed to do. To return Jacob to him. So that's one of the jobs of the Messiah. And Israel gathered up. And I will be glorified in the eyes of Adonai, and God shall be my strength. He says, so this is God speaking to the servant. It is too trivial a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the clans or scepters of Jacob and return the protected ones, the watched over ones, literally, of Israel. I will give you as a light to the Goyim, as a light to the Gentiles, to be my salvation. Literally in Hebrew, that is my Yeshua, unto the ends of the earth. And we talked about this in the biblical church last summer. But this is another aspect of it, is that he's saying the protected ones. Now, who are the protected ones within the people of Israel? This is very specific. Who has to come back in the people of Israel to inherit the kingdom? The believing populace of Israel. You see that? The believing remnant of Israel, and on top of that, who will be left at the end of the tribulation? Who's left amongst Israel to embrace the Messiah? Nothing but the remnant, right? It's a very sad story, but at the same time, at the very end of it, all Israel will be saved in Romans is all those left alive will come to faith and join their remnant brethren. And he says, it's too small a thing for you to just gather them together like this and raise up the scepters of the clans of Jacob. That's the word for tribe. He says, that's not enough. He says, you have to be a light to the Goyim, to the Gentiles, to be my Yeshua, my salvation unto the entire earth. What does that say about the ones who are watched over? They are what? Saved. Because those who are watched over will have what? His what? Salvation. Do you see that? This is so important. Because this denotes a function of the Messiah. Wrapped up in a word here, but the Messiah is, if they are the protected ones, the Messiah does what? He protects, which means he does that verb buried in there. I've got the letters highlighted. He does that so that they are protected. You follow me? And so we have to see that this is part of the prophecy concerning the coming Messiah. And Jude understands this because he's writing to who? Jewish believers. Jude gets this. Let's keep going. So we're going to continue in verses 7 and 8. Isaiah keeps repeating this. Thus says Adonai, the kinsman redeemer of Israel. That's literally what it says. His Holy One, so this is the Messiah. He's a despised soul. So to the despised soul, the one abhorred by the nation. So even though he's going to do all these things, he's still abhorred. To the servant of rulers. So he's going to be a servant of rulers. This is amazing because you can see the two advents of Christ right in these two verses. Kings will see and princes will rise up. So he who was a servant to rulers, one day kings will gaze on him and princes will rise up. And they will cause themselves to fall prostrate on account of Adonai, who is faithful, the Holy One of Israel, and he has chosen you. Now look at the play on words there. Up in verse 7, who's the Holy One? That's the Messiah. Do you see that? Who is Isaiah saying is the Holy One of Israel in the bottom? God. Who is the Messiah? He's God. You see that? It's the same phrase. And it's saying that God has chosen this Messiah who is God. Thus says Adonai, in a determined time, I will answer you, and in the day of salvation, in the day of Yeshua, I will help you. And God is watching over the Messiah. So not only is the Messiah watching over Israel as the Holy One, God watches over the Messiah. It's still Natsar. And give you over for a covenant to the people. Was the Messiah given over as a covenant? Absolutely. You can see the advents of Messiah. He has to do two functions. Kings will fall prostrate because of him, but he has to be given over as a covenant. You can't separate the two. To raise up the land, to cause them to possess astounding heritages. Sometimes that's translated negative. It's not really negative there. It's that they're meant to possess great things. What does that mean? What does it mean when Matthew writes that Jesus, as a boy with Mary and Joseph, the other kids aren't on the scene yet, so we actually do have the Holy Family of three. They came and lived in a city called Nazareth, Notzrat. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophets, plural. And that is plural in the Greek New Testament. He shall be called a Nazarene. In Hebrew, this is Notzri. And it's from the root Natsar. Prophets. What did the prophets say about the coming Messiah? We have to pay close attention to this. And usually what a lot of Bible commentators do, and I've never bought into this, it never sat well with me as the answer to Matthew 2:23 as far as messianic prophecy goes, is it sounds something like this when you read a commentary. That Nathanael in John 1:46, when some followers of John, Andrew and them, come and tell Nathanael, hey, this man's coming from Nazareth, he could be the Messiah. And then Nathanael asks this great question that's always in every Jesus film, right? Can anything good come out of Nazareth? And Philip, who's a disciple of John the Baptist, says, come and see. And there's been this entire, how do I put this? Stereotype that because of what Nathanael says right there, that first century Jews just didn't like the town of Nazareth, and therefore that's what we should read in Matthew 2:23, is that Jesus grew up in a town that was disliked, and because he was disliked as a suffering servant, it must have something to do with being a Nazarene. And that's usually, I hate to put it this way, it's usually the excuse that's given. And they completely skip which part? What was spoken through who? None of the prophets were alive in first century Israel, except for John, right? But the prophets who wrote in the scriptures, they were alive 400 years before. Church, how many times is the town of Nazareth mentioned in the Old Testament? You hit it this many times. Nazareth does not exist in any of the Old Testament writings. So to say that it doesn't sit well with me that he's called a Nazarene for living because he lives in Nazareth. It's tied to this word that because Nathanael said something, we should create a stereotype of first century Jews not liking the town of Nazareth. It's a little hokey, to say the least. There's something else going on here because Matthew's saying the prophets said this about the Messiah, that he'll be called a Nazarene. And on top of that, if Nazareth as the town was so important to Jesus, we have to take into account that Jesus dissed his own town. Okay? So when he reads from the scroll in the synagogue, and they reject him, including some of his own relatives, he says, truly I say to you, no prophet is acceptable in his hometown. Now, if his identity is with those fellow Nazarenes, that just the rest of the Jewish world hates them, why is Jesus dissing the rest of them who are throwing him out of the synagogue? It doesn't make sense. It's not logical. And in Mark 6:4, and Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown, among his relatives, and in his own household. Now that comes right off of Mark 6 that we looked at 2 weeks ago, where it names all his brothers and sisters and says, isn't this the son of a carpenter? How does he know these things? That's Jesus' follow-up statement. As he says, look, I'm not going to be welcome in Nazareth. That's a given. None of the prophets were welcome in their hometown. So this really doesn't have to do with people's disdain for Nazareth, because even Jesus showed some disdain for Nazareth. You follow me? There's something else going on here. So let's look at something else. Let's put this back up here. And we're going to dive into something that is hidden in plain sight. Okay, I've highlighted it, but this is hidden in plain sight, and I want you to follow me with this. Because when you start to understand what Matthew's getting at, and remember, Matthew is one of those conversational Greek writers, so he could have some Semitic stuff in there. The town of Nazareth is pronounced Notzrat. Notzrat. Still exists in Israel today. In Aramaic, Nazaret. That's why we call it Nazareth in the Greek New Testament, is that Nazaret is how you say it in Aramaic. In Hebrew, it's Notzrat. But it's the town, and it means something like watchman town, observable town, observant town. But what is very unique about Nazareth, if you've ever been to Israel, you can probably identify with this. You go anywhere in Galilee, you can go to the south side of the lake, west side of the lake, north side of the lake, doesn't matter. You can see Nazareth. It's probably where it got its name. Is that because anywhere you go, you can see Nazareth. And so it got this name of the town that is observable, which has zero bearing on him being a Nazarene except the play on words, because if you look there, the three letters are the same as the top right corner. Okay? If you're from Nazareth, and here's the play on words, you are a notzer, the noun form, which means you are a notzer by default of being a citizen of Nazareth or a resident of Nazareth. However, the play on words is when you say notzer out loud, it means that you're a watchman. You see that? So the town that's observable, a Nazareth resident, is also, every time you say it, it's like saying, oh, you're a watchman. You're a watchman. Right? You follow me? So if you say I'm a Baltimorean, I'm from Baltimore, does that mean you're from Lord Baltimore's family? No, it means I'm from Baltimore, right? But 200 years ago, if you're a Baltimorean, you're probably from the estate of Lord Baltimore. So there's a play on words there that if you go back to the 1700s or 1600s, whenever the aristocracy was still here, if you say I'm a Baltimorean, that could mean that you're from Lord Baltimore's family. That's the double entendre, double play on words that's going on here, is that Jesus is a notzer, which means that his parents settled in a town that gave him the title that the Old Testament prophets said he would bear. There's some divine irony in Jesus moving to Nazareth. You see that? To be a Nazarene means you're notzri, and this is the word for Christian in Hebrew. They don't say Christian. Even in Israel today, if you're a Christian, ani notzri. There's two words we use when you're in Israel. One's messianic, Mashiachi, the other one is notzri. And it's the same in Arabic. We're going to see this. This remained in the Middle East, and we kind of lost this in Western culture. But the idea that Jesus is a notzer, he's a watchman, does the Bible say that the Messiah was going to be a protector and a watchman? It says it in Isaiah. And it uses the actual term that the things he does gives him this word, notzer. He is by title a watchman, an observer. So in other words, and I put this in parentheses, in case anyone was wondering who the Messiah is, reading the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew says, it's so obvious God put him in a town that is a title that he would bear in the Old Testament. That's what he's saying with prophets, plural, he shall be called a Nazarene, is that he is this Messiah watchman. And that's exactly what Isaiah 49 says. So here's the other terms, right? Mashiachi, we say messianic, and sometimes you'll hear Notzri, I'm Nazarene. The ancient Jewish believers were called the Nazarenes. Today, sometimes you'll hear messianic, Mashiachi. But what's very interesting is when you go to the Arabic-speaking world, they use the same terms. Mashkian and Al-Mashian, sorry, and Nazranyu. I've been in Arabic neighborhoods, and they, instead of saying, I'll say Ani Notzri, Nazranyu. Okay, come here, you're Christian, okay. This is so common across the Arabic-speaking world. This has not left the Semitic world in the last 2,000 years. They don't say Christ-like or Christian. They use Nazarene. Why? It was such a rooted term for the first century believers that they were calling Jesus the Nazarene, and they started getting called Nazarenes. When Paul goes on trial in the book of Acts, they say he's from that sect of what? The Nazarenes. When he appears before the Sanhedrin, they're already calling him Nazarenes. And the funny play on words there is you could be, as a Nazarene, you could be the one overwatching or you can be the one watched. If you're the one like the Notzer, then you're the one being watched by the watchman. Let's go back to Jude now, because what is Jude saying? Jude knows all of this. Almost every other line in Jude is some kind of messianic indication or going back to places where God appears while man's going bad. To those summoned, well, that's a loaded statement now. Having been loved in God the Father and having been watched over or protected in Jesus Christ, the Nazarene. You see it now? Will the Jewish believers get this? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. If they have any problem, they should just go have a chat with Matthew. Because Matthew says, by the way, the town that he grew up in is actually his title at the same time. That the one who Natsars over you is who? He doesn't say it's God the Father on purpose. Why is he doing that? He's trying to point it toward who? The Messiah. May peace or mercy, peace, and love be multiplied to you. This is who the Messiah is. This is one of his key roles. That does not just mean that Jesus is seated in heaven. It's actually a title he has in the Old Testament prophets. And Jude just takes it for granted. Says, I got it. You think Matthew got it? I had to grow up with him. We figured it out. Once we figured out he was the Messiah, we figured out, oh wow, that's why God put our family in Nazareth. And he just uses it as a verb here in tereo. Let's pray together. Lord, I pray we understand that we are called to take your word seriously. We're not called to take it lightly. Lord, your word is meant to be studied and discussed and food eaten around it. And we go into the deep things as to who you are. You gave us your revelation so that we would understand who God is, not so that we could have an emotional 1-hour devotion, but we would actually study who our God is and be illuminated to who our God is, who our Creator is, and who we are as your creatures. Lord, I pray that we take your word seriously, that these people that are studying your scriptures and doing the exercises to learn to study your scriptures are taking these seriously, because it will inform them for the rest of their lives. Ignorance is bliss, and you take the ignorance away. It will be a challenge. And that's good, because we will grow as we understand more. Guide us in that. Help us understand that there is meaning in everything that we do, including celebrating this when we gather together and remember your death until you come and you bring something new. I ask this in your name. Amen.
you.